The planet died screaming. Not in the way stars die, slow, majestic, collapsing into themselves over millennia, but violently, without warning, without mercy. Krypton's core had been cracking for years while its greatest minds argued in marble halls and dismissed the one man shouting loudest about the end. Jor-El had been right. He had always been right. And now the planet that refused to listen was paying for its arrogance in fire and gravity and silence. The rocket launched in the final seconds, small enough to miss, fast enough to matter. Inside, wrapped in a capsule barely larger than a cradle, an infant slept through the apocalypse with his fists curled and his chest rising and falling in the rhythm of someone who had no idea the universe had just swallowed everything he would ever have known. Jor-El had programmed the coordinates for a small blue world orbiting a yellow sun, a quiet planet, a safe one, a place where the boy's Kryptonian biology would absorb solar radiation and become something extraordinary. Not a weapon, not a god, but a protector, a man first with power second. That had been the plan. Plans, like planets, do not always survive contact with the cosmos. The shockwave from Krypton's detonation hit the rocket 17 seconds after launch. Not enough to destroy it. Jor-El had built it to withstand catastrophe, but enough to knock it sideways through a spatial fold that had no name in any Kryptonian star chart. The pod tumbled through energies that bent light into colors that physics had no language for, spinning through a corridor between realities, between cosmologies, between worlds that operated on entirely different rules than the one it had left. When it emerged, it was no longer heading toward Earth. It was falling toward Asgard. The eternal realm announced itself in gold and thunder. From a distance, it looked like something a civilization had dreamed up to comfort itself against the dark, too beautiful, too deliberate, too luminous to be accidental. The Bifrost shimmered at its edge like a wound in reality that never fully healed. The palace rose from the realm's heart like a declaration, and cutting through the outer atmosphere on a campaign return, aboard a ship whose hull was carved with the names of every battle it had survived, Odin Allfather looked up from the star charts his navigator had spread across the war table and frowned. Something was falling. Something small, something burning, something that was not a meteor, because meteors did not decelerate. He watched it descend. He watched it survive the entry that should have destroyed it, and when his soldiers retrieved the smoking pod from a field of wheat outside the realm's eastern border and cracked it open with axes and sorcery and sheer Asgardian stubbornness, what they found inside made even Odin, who had held the eye he sacrificed and called the pain wisdom, go very still. A child, black-haired, blue-eyed, breathing steadily despite everything, with his fists still curled. Odin reached in and lifted him without hesitation. "Bring me Frigga," he said quietly. Nobody asked why. They had seen the look on his face before. Once, years ago, on a frozen battlefield, standing over a small frost giant infant abandoned in the cold. The Allfather had a habit of collecting sons from the wreckage of other people's catastrophes. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want them to see them in down in the comments below. May the Force be with you. Frigga named him Kal. Odin had wanted something Asgardian, something that rang like iron on a shield, something that the Skalds could work with. Frigga had looked at the child sleeping in the golden cradle they'd moved from storage, at the strange symbol stitched into the fabric of his swaddling, and told Odin that the boy already had a name from whoever had loved him enough to put him in that rocket. They would keep part of it. They would honor the grief of parents they would never meet. So he became Kal, son of Odin, prince of Asgard, brother, eventually, to a golden-haired boy named Thor, who arrived 2 years later and immediately tried to share his wooden hammer with the infant in the neighboring cradle. They grew up the way brothers do, in competition and alliance, in laughter and bruises, in the complicated grammar of two people who are shaped by the same forces but made of entirely different material. Thor was Asgardian to the marrow, loud, instinctive, magnetic, born understanding that the world responded to boldness. Kal was something else, quieter, more watchful. He observed before he acted, which drove Thor halfway to madness in their boyhood sparring sessions and made Frigga smile when she thought neither of them was looking. The differences became harder to ignore as they aged. By his 12th year, Kal was lifting training stones that the older warriors used as landmarks rather than equipment. By his 15th, his eyes had begun to do something that no Asgardian eye had ever done, a faint luminescence and darkness, a heat that wasn't quite a glow, but made the air around his gaze shimmer when he was angry or afraid. Odin watched these developments with the careful neutrality of a man who knew more than he was saying, which was simply how Odin moved through most of his life. The court noticed. Courts always notice. The warriors three, Fandral, Volstagg, Hogun, adapted with the flexibility of men who had survived enough strangeness that one more variety barely registered. Sif noticed and filed it away in the part of her mind she reserved for tactical information about people she might one day fight beside or against. The palace servants noticed and developed a collective, unspoken policy of not mentioning it. Loki noticed and said nothing at all, which was the most dangerous response of the available options. Odin had told both princes the same thing in private on separate occasions. Kal was adopted. He came from somewhere beyond the 9 realms. His blood was not Asgardian. He was their brother in every way that mattered, in love, in law, in loyalty. But the power that was growing inside him was not the power of Asgard. It was something older, something solar, something that the realm's golden sun was feeding in ways that Odin's own court sorcerers were still mapping with expressions of barely concealed alarm. Thor's response had been immediate and characteristically Thor. He had found Kal in the training yard the next morning, gripped his shoulder hard enough to leave a mark on anyone else, and said, "It changes nothing," with the absolute conviction of someone who had never once doubted that love was a decision rather than a condition. Kal had looked at his brother for a long moment. Then he had nodded, and they had gone back to sparring, and that had been the end of it. For a while.
The rivalry sharpened as they grew, because rivalry between brothers who love each other always does. It is not cruelty, it is the whetstone they use to make each other better. And by the time Kal and Thor reached the age that Asgardians begin to think seriously about war, they had made each other very good indeed. Thor was stronger in the way that Asgardians measure strength, explosive, thunderous, the kind of force that announced itself and demanded response. He had claimed Mjolnir at 19 in a ceremony that the entire court attended, and the hammer had come to his hand without hesitation, without drama, as though it had simply been waiting. The crowd had roared. Odin had allowed himself a rare, unguarded smile. Kal had watched from the front row, genuinely proud, and also aware of the quiet question sitting at the back of his own mind. What was he if Thor was the thunder? He found partial answers in the years that followed. His speed developed first, not the rolling acceleration of a sprinter, but something instantaneous, a rearrangement of position that left after images and confused opponents who were experienced enough to know that what they were seeing was not possible.
His strength grew past what Asgardian measurement systems had reliable scales for, and the heat vision arrived in full force during a training accident in the Eastern Armory that left a long scar in solid Asgardian stone and sent 3 instructors diving behind a weapons rack. Odin reviewed the damage personally. He stood in the scorched armory for a long time without speaking. "Can you control it?" he asked. "Getting better," said Cal. "Good," said Odin, in the tone that meant the conversation was over and also meant he was quietly impressed. What the All-Father never said aloud, what he carried alone in the way that rulers carry things they cannot afford to distribute, was that Cal's power had no ceiling he could locate. Thor's strength was extraordinary, godly, worthy of legend, but Cal's was something that Odin's deepest sorcerers, consulting texts that predated Asgard's founding, kept describing with a word that made the All-Father uncomfortable: infinite. Not metaphorically, literally. The solar absorption was continuous, compounding, building toward something that their models couldn't project an upper boundary for. He was not raising a prince. He was raising a force of nature that had learned, through Frigga's love and Asgardian tradition and years of brotherhood with Thor, to behave like a prince. The distinction mattered. Loki understood it before anyone else did, because Loki always understood the distinctions that other people were too comfortable to examine. He watched Cal during court functions with an expression that visitors sometimes mistook for admiration and was actually something far more complex: a sorcerer's assessment of variables, a strategist's inventory of threats, a younger brother's precise and painful accounting of where he ranked in a family that kept adding people above him. Loki had accepted being second to Thor. He had built an entire identity around the elegant necessity of operating in a golden brother's shadow. He had not agreed to be third. And in the quiet hours of the library, surrounded by star charts and genetic theory and texts on Kryptonian biology that he had gone to considerable lengths to obtain, Loki began to understand exactly what Odin had brought home from that field of wheat, and exactly how that knowledge might eventually be useful.
The campaign against the Frost Giants came in Cal's 23rd year, triggered by a border incursion in the Outer Realms that Odin declared required a show of force rather than diplomacy. Thor greeted the news with his usual enthusiasm, which was to say he nearly took a door off its hinges walking out of the War Council. Cal received it differently. He spent the night before departure on the Bifrost's observation platform, watching the stars and thinking about the nature of enemies, which was something Thor rarely did and which Frigga had quietly encouraged in Cal since he was old enough to ask difficult questions. The army moved through the Bifrost like a golden tide and arrived in Jotunheim's perpetual cold with the kind of confidence that came from centuries of established dominance. Cal felt the temperature drop and found it almost pleasant. His Kryptonian physiology processed cold differently than Asgardian biology, regulating without effort, while the warriors around him pulled cloaks tighter and exhaled steam. The battle began in a mountain pass 2 hours into the campaign. The Frost Giants emerged from the ice shelves with the coordinated aggression of a people who had been waiting rather than retreating, and within 60 seconds it was clear that the border incursion had been a provocation, designed to draw Asgardian forces into terrain that neutralized their advantages, surrounded by enemies who had spent decades preparing for exactly this engagement. Thor hit the front line like a judgment. Lightning came down from a sky that had been clear a moment before, and giants who had stood 30 feet tall found themselves stumbling backward from a single strike. The warriors three carved through the flanks with the technical precision of lifetimes spent in exactly this kind of fighting. Cal moved through the battle differently. He didn't announce himself. He didn't call lightning or roar challenges. He simply
appeared where the pressure was worst, where Asgardian shield walls were buckling, where giants had broken through the formation, where soldiers were about to be overrun, and the problem stopped. A giant's arm raised to crush 3 men was caught in a grip that made the giant look genuinely confused before the momentum reversed, and it was the giant moving backward through the air. Ice constructs that would have killed squads dissolved in twin beams of concentrated heat that Cal had finally learned to aim with precision. The Warriors 3 noticed first. Volstagg pulled Fandrel's sleeve during a brief pause in the fighting and pointed without words. Fandrel watched Cal for a long moment, the speed, the ease, the complete absence of strain in anything he was doing, and said quietly, "I've fought beside him for 2 years, and I still don't think I understand what he is." "Neither does he," Volstagg replied, which was more perceptive than his usual commentary. What neither of them saw, because it happened at a speed that registered as a blur at best, was the moment a frost giant chieftain brought an ice spear down toward an injured Asgardian soldier, and Cal crossed 40 meters in a fraction of a second and caught the spear in one hand. The chieftain stared. The ice began to melt from the point of contact outward, and the heat was coming from Cal's grip. The chieftain said something in Jotun that translated roughly as, "What manner of creature are you?" Cal looked at him steadily. The ice kept melting. "Asgardian," he said, and threw the spear back hard enough to crack the mountain behind it. The battle ended 40 minutes later. The victory was total. But in the debrief that night, around fires that did little against Jotunheim's cold, the conversations kept returning to the same moments: the speed, the heat, the effortlessness, and the question the frost giant chieftain had asked lingered in the firelit air without anyone quite willing to answer it directly. Thor clapped Cal on the shoulder hard enough to stagger a lesser being, and called it the finest fighting he'd ever witnessed. Loki, seated apart from the celebration, wrote something in a small journal he kept encrypted with sorcery that only he could read. He wrote it twice to make sure he had the phrasing right.
Loki moved the way water moves through stone, not by force, but by finding every crack and widening it slowly until the structure could no longer remember what it had been before. He began with information, not accusations, not confrontations, but careful, surgical revelations delivered in the right ears at the right moments. A word to a court historian about inconsistencies in the official record of Cal's arrival. A copy of a Kryptonian genetic text left open on a table in the library where Sif would find it. A quiet conversation with one of Odin's senior sorcerers about the theoretical upper boundary of solar-charged Kryptonian power, not framed as concern, but as intellectual curiosity, which was plausible enough that the sorcerer didn't think to mention it to the Allfather until much later. The seeds were small. The garden he was growing was not. What Loki wanted was not Cal's destruction. He was precise about this in his own mind because precision mattered and self-deception was a weakness he refused. He did not hate Cal. In a different architecture of circumstance, he might have even admired him. What Loki wanted was leverage, understanding, the specific and usable knowledge of what Cal truly was, because in a family where Thor had thunder, and Odin had wisdom, and Frigga had love, Loki had always survived on knowing things others didn't. Cal was the largest unknown variable in the 9 realms. Loki intended to solve him. The opportunity arrived 6 months after Jotunheim, during a state feast that brought dignitaries from 4 of the 9 realms to Asgard's Great Hall. Loki arranged a private meeting with a Vanir scholar who had spent decades researching dimensional anomalies, the kind of spatial fold that might theoretically redirect a small rocket from one cosmic destination to another. The scholar confirmed what Loki already suspected. The redirection had not been accidental. The fold that caught Cal's pod had been a natural phenomenon, yes, but natural phenomena of that specific type occurred near Krypton's coordinates approximately once every 10,000 years. The odds of it occurring in the precise seconds after Krypton's detonation were, in the scholar's careful language, not meaningfully distinguishable from zero. Loki sat with that for a long moment. So, something guided it, he said. The scholar looked uncomfortable. The data suggests a degree of intentionality. Yes. Loki thanked him, paid him generously, and spent the walk back to the palace turning the implication over, like a stone that might have something living under it. Odin had not found Cal by accident. Odin had known, or something with the scope to redirect the physics of a dying planet's final moments had decided that this specific child needed to land in this specific realm, raised by this specific family, alongside this specific golden brother, trained by this specific culture of war and honor and Norse cosmological certainty. The question was why? And the deeper question, the one that Loki filed in the part of his mind reserved for things that genuinely unsettled him, was whether Cal knew. He found Cal that evening on the training grounds, running drills alone after the feast had wound down. There was something almost meditative about it. The speed, the precision, the complete self-containment of a man who had learned to exist inside enormous power but without being consumed by it. Loki watched for a while before speaking. "Brother," he said, and the word carried, as it always did with Loki, several meanings simultaneously.
The conversation lasted until the stars shifted. Loki did not reveal everything he knew, he never did, with anyone, but he gave Cal enough. The spatial fold, the odds, the veneer scholar's careful, uncomfortable word, intentionality. He delivered it without editorializing, which was its own kind of manipulation, because raw information with no interpretive frame forces the recipient to build their own meaning, and the meaning people build themselves is always the one that cuts deepest. Cal listened without interrupting. This was something about him that Loki had always found both admirable and faintly unnerving. The capacity to receive difficult information without immediate reaction, to hold it at arm's length and examine it before deciding what it meant to him. Thor would have argued, Odin would have redirected. Cal simply listened, and when Loki finished, he looked up at the stars for a long time. "You think Father knew," he said, not a question. "I think," Loki said carefully, "that very little arrives in Asgard without the All-Father's awareness." Cal nodded slowly. "And you're telling me this because you deserve to know what you are," Loki said, and meant it, which made it the most dangerous thing he said all evening. The information spread outward from that night like a stone dropped in still water. Cal sought a private audience with Odin, who confirmed, with the measured candor of a man who had been waiting for this conversation for 23 years, that yes, he had known the pod was coming. A Volva, a seeress of considerable power, had told him 3 days before Krypton died that something would fall from beyond the 9 realms, something that would change the cosmic balance if raised correctly. Odin had stationed ships near the point of arrival. He had chosen to bring the child home. He had chosen not to explain this because explanations shape people, and he had wanted Cal shaped by love and experience rather than the weight of prophecy. Cal walked out of that meeting into a hallway that looked exactly the same as it had before and felt entirely different. The news of what he was, not just adopted, not just Kryptonian, but apparently intended, moved through the court in the way that significant truths always move through courts, officially unacknowledged, universally known. Reactions divided along predictable lines. Thor, when Cal told him directly, shrugged with magnificent Asgardian indifference and said that destiny choosing his brother only proved destiny had excellent judgment. Sif recalibrated her assessment of Cal with the quiet efficiency of a warrior updating tactical intelligence. The dignitaries and ambassadors from the Outer Realms updated their reports to their respective rulers. Those reports traveled through the 9 realms and beyond. And in a fortress carved from the bones of a dead moon in the space between galaxies, a being of immense and ancient purpose received an intelligence report and read it twice. Thanos had been tracking anomalies in cosmic power distribution for decades. It was, in a way, his vocation. The Infinity Stones were the primary focus, but the stones were not the only objects of his attention. Anything that might compete with or complicate his ultimate ambition warranted monitoring. A Kryptonian raised on Asgard, absorbing solar energy from a golden star, reaching physical maturity with no apparent ceiling on his power development. This warranted more than monitoring. Thanos set down the report and looked at the star chart on his wall. Asgard glowed on it like an ember.
The betrayal, when it came, did not look like betrayal. It looked like a gift. Loki had spent months constructing it with the patience of a craftsman who understood that the best traps are the ones the target walks into freely, without pressure, following something that genuinely looks like what they need. He had studied Cal with the thoroughness he applied to everything that mattered, the hunger to understand his own origins, the quiet, unresolved grief for parents he never knew, the way his eyes sometimes went distant during feasts when the celebration was loudest, as though he was listening for something just beyond the noise. What Cal needed was a connection to Krypton. Loki gave him one. It came in the form of a Kryptonian data crystal, small, translucent, pulsing with stored light, that Loki presented to Cal in private, with an explanation that was mostly true. He had tracked it through a network of dimensional scholars, acquired it through channels he declined to specify, and believed it contained recordings from Krypton's final days, scientific archives, personal logs, possibly messages from people who had known the family that put a child in a rocket. Cal held the crystal for a long time before saying anything. "Why?" he finally asked. "Because I have not always been the brother I should have been," Loki said. And the remarkable, devastating thing was that in this moment, he was not performing. He meant it. The manipulation and the genuine feeling existed simultaneously, which was simply the condition of being Loki. Nothing was ever entirely one thing. What Cal did not know was that the crystal had been modified. The Kryptonian data was real. Loki had gone to genuine lengths to find it. But layered beneath the surface recordings was a secondary function, a sorcerous construct of Loki's own design, a consciousness map, a mirror that would show Cal the full scope of his own power as Loki's instruments had measured it, not as a weapon, as a revelation. Loki wanted Cal to understand exactly what he was capable of, because a being who doesn't understand their own power is unpredictable, and unpredictable forces serve no one's plans, including Loki's. The crystal activated in Cal's chamber that night. What it showed him first was Krypton, sunlit spires, white cities, a civilization of extraordinary complexity and tragic hubris. His father's face, his mother's hands placing him in the rocket, the expression on Jor-El's face in the final seconds, which was not fear, but something much harder to carry. Absolute love, delivered into an uncertain universe with no guarantee of return. Cal sat on the floor of his chamber for a very long time. Then the secondary layer activated, and he saw himself, not as he experienced himself from within, but as Loki's instruments had mapped him from without.
The solar absorption levels, the strength projections, the heat vision output measured against the destructive capacity of Asgard's most powerful weapons and found to be categorically beyond comparison. He saw the word Loki's sorcerers had used, infinite. He sat with that, too. When he finally emerged from his chamber, 2 days after entering it, he found Thor waiting in the corridor with a plate of food and no questions. They sat together against the wall like they were 12 years old again, and Thor did not ask what he'd seen, and Cal did not offer it, and the brotherhood between them, complicated now, reshaped by revelation, but unbroken, held in the silence the way it always had. What neither of them knew was that Loki had already sent a message, not to Thanos, not yet, to an intermediary, a dimensional broker of considerable reach who moved information between parties that preferred not to correspond directly. The message was simple. Asgard has something worth making an offer for.
The emissary arrived through the Bifrost without invitation, which was either extraordinary arrogance or a demonstration of capability designed to establish negotiating position before the first word was spoken. Heimdall had seen him coming from 3 realms away and said nothing, not because he approved, but because Odin had given him standing orders regarding beings of sufficient cosmic stature, and this one qualified. The emissary was tall, purple-robed, and carried himself with the particular composure of someone who worked for a being that didn't lose. He spoke to Odin in the great hall with Asgard's entire court present, because he had specifically requested an audience that was public. His name was Kal Obsidian's predecessor in the hierarchy, an envoy from the children of Thanos, designated for diplomatic overtures. He brought 2 propositions, delivered in sequence with the cadence of someone who had rehearsed them in order of ascending pressure. The first proposition: Thanos admired what Asgard had built. He sought no conflict with the Eternal Realm. He was prepared to offer considerable consideration, influence, resources, protection in the coming restructuring of the universe's order, in exchange for voluntary cooperation. The cooperation requested was Kal, not as prisoner, as ally. Thanos wished to meet the Kryptonian prince, to discuss his nature, his potential, the direction of his power. The offer was framed as an invitation. The second proposition, delivered after a precisely timed pause. If the voluntary option was declined, Thanos wished Asgard to understand that he had not achieved his position by accepting the word no as a terminus. The hall was very quiet when he finished. Odin looked at the emissary for a long moment with the eye that remained, the one that had seen 10,000 years of threats, empires, and the particular variety of being who confused power with inevitability. Then he said 3 words that left no room for interpretation and had the emissary escorted off Asgard's soil before the echo faded. The council convened immediately. Kal stood in that room and felt something clarify inside him with the cold precision of a lens coming into focus. For weeks he had been navigating the dislocation of what the crystal had shown him, the grief of Krypton, the vertigo of infinite, and the process had left him with the particular vulnerability of a person between old certainties and new ones. The emissary's visit resolved that. There was something almost clarifying about being openly threatened, about having the abstract question of what he was reduced to a concrete and immediate, "What will you do?" He knew the answer. What he also knew, reviewing the encounter with the unsettling detachment he sometimes deployed on problems, was that Thanos had not sent an emissary to realms he expected to simply acquire. He sent emissaries to realms he was still assessing. The visit was reconnaissance as much as it was ultimatum, a measurement of how Asgard received the name, how the court reacted, specifically how Kal reacted.
He had been calm. He had kept his face still and his hands loose at his sides while the emissary spoke, and he had felt the heat building behind his eyes and declined to let it arrive. He reviewed that choice later and found it was the right one. But there was something else, a detail that his particular brand of quiet observation had caught and filed away during the encounter. When the emissary's eyes had moved across the assembled court, they had paused on Loki for exactly 2 seconds longer than anyone else. Not in threat, in recognition. Karl held that detail in the back of his mind and said nothing to anyone. He trained harder instead, not from fear. Fear was not the precise emotion, but from the clear-eyed acknowledgement that whatever was coming, he intended to be ready for it in a way that being a prince of Asgard had never quite required him to be before. The stars outside his window looked different at night now, less like home, more like distance.
The attack came at dawn, which was either tactical poetry or Surtur's particular sense of drama. Fire against the first light, darkness arriving precisely when the realm exhaled and believed itself safe. Cal heard it before the alarms. His hearing had been developing in ways that still occasionally startled him. The ability to isolate a single sound from an ocean of noise, to pull one frequency from the chaos and identify it with absolute clarity. What he heard 3 seconds before Heimdall's warning rang across the Bifrost was the sound of 10,000 armored feet landing on Asgardian soil simultaneously. He was already moving. Surtur had not come alone, which was the tactical complication that Odin's war council had failed to anticipate. The fire giants had arrived in force, yes, but alongside them came something older and darker, a vanguard of shadow constructs that Cal had no name for, and that moved through Asgardian defenses like smoke through a lattice, insubstantial until they weren't, until they were inside the defensive perimeter and cutting through palace guardsmen with weapons that burned cold rather than hot. Loki's message had reached more than one recipient. The realization arrived in Cal's mind with the quiet certainty of something he had already half known. The 2-second recognition in the emissary's eyes, the timing of the attack against a palace whose defensive rotations Loki understood precisely, the shadow constructs that bore the signature of a specific sorceress tradition he had seen in Loki's private texts. He filed it away without anger, which took more effort than he would have admitted, and kept moving, because the palace was burning, and the people inside it were what mattered. He found Thor at the main gates, Mjolnir already singing with accumulated lightning, holding a breach that 6 fire giants were trying to widen. Cal arrived at a velocity that left a visible compression wave in the air behind him and hit the giant formation from the flank with force enough to feel geological. The line broke. 3 giants went backward into their own ranks. Thor shot him a look of pure, uncomplicated joy in the middle of catastrophe, which was so thoroughly Thor that Cal almost laughed. "Took you long enough," Thor said. "I stopped for breakfast," Cal said, and then a shadow construct collapsed the wall section above them, and they both moved without further conversation. The battle divided itself across 3 fronts. Thor held the outer gates with the Warriors 3, lightning and hammer working in the devastating combination that had ended 100 campaigns. Sif commanded the palace interior with the controlled ferocity of someone defending something personal. Cal moved between all 3 fronts at speeds that the fire giants couldn't track and the shadow constructs couldn't anticipate. Here to intercept a construct before it reached the civilian quarters, there to redirect a river of fire that Surtur himself had sent toward the palace's eastern wing. Surtur noticed him eventually. The fire giant king was enormous, not 30 feet but 100, ancient and furnace-hot, carrying a flaming sword that had the particular aura of something that had ended worlds before. He turned from the destruction he was methodically working through Asgard's outer structures and looked at the figure moving through his forces like a fault line through stone. "Small thing," Surtur said, in a voice like a collapsing forge.
Cal looked up at him. The heat from Surtur's body was significant, not uncomfortable but measurable, and some part of his Kryptonian biology was already processing it, already converting it, already adding it to the continuous accumulation that his sorcerers had called infinite. "You should leave," Cal said. Surtur swung his sword. What happened next was the moment that Asgard's skalds would argue about for generations, not the outcome, but the nature of it, the specific quality of what they witnessed. Cal caught the blade, not deflected it, not dodged it, caught the edge of a weapon that had unmade civilizations, held it in both hands while the fire ran up his arms and disappeared, absorbed, converted, added to something that was already beyond their instruments to measure. Surtur stared. The sword began, slowly and unmistakably, to cool.
The cooling of Surtur's sword lasted 11 seconds. Cal felt the fire moving through him like a language he was learning in real time. Hot, ancient, cosmically arrogant in the way that only truly primordial forces are arrogant, certain of their own supremacy in the way that things which have never met their ceiling tend to be. He let it move. He didn't fight it or redirect it. He simply held it, the way Frigga had taught him to hold difficult things, fully, without flinching, until you understood their shape. Then he pushed back. The heat that left his hands was not Surtur's fire returned. It was something synthesized, something that had passed through Kryptonian biology and emerged changed, hotter, more focused, carrying the concentrated output of a being who had been absorbing solar energy from Asgard's golden star for 23 years and had just spent a battle converting a fire giant army's thermal output on top of it. The twin beams that came from his eyes hit Surtur's chest with a sound like reality objecting. Surtur staggered. For the first time in an age that predated Asgard's founding, the ancient fire of Muspelheim took a step backward. Cal followed. What followed was not elegant. It was not the kind of battle the skalds would render in neat, heroic stanzas. It was grinding, absolute, the meeting of two forces that had no common language except impact. Surtur brought his cooling sword down in strikes that would have leveled mountains, and Cal moved through them with the accumulated precision of 23 years of Asgardian training applied to Kryptonian physics. He was faster than Surtur could track. He was stronger than Surtur could match, and with every exchange, every burst of fire that Surtur threw and Cal absorbed, the imbalance widened. Thor arrived at the critical moment, not because Cal needed saving, but because Thor had never once in his life been capable of watching his brother fight alone when he had breath and a hammer left. Lightning came down from a sky he had personally darkened, and the combined assault of Kryptonian solar force and Asgardian thunder hit Surtur simultaneously from angles that left no geometric solution. Surtur fell. Not destroyed. Ancient things of that magnitude don't simply end, but defeated, diminished, driven back toward Muspelheim's border with his army broken around him and his sword cold for the first time in recorded history.
He turned at the boundary, immense and furious and reduced, and looked at Cal with the specific expression of a being recalibrating a threat assessment it had never expected to recalibrate. "What are you?" he demanded, in an echo that Cal had heard before, in a frozen mountain pass, from a frost giant chieftain who had never expected an answer. Cal looked at him across the scorched earth between them, at the retreating army, the cooling battlefield, the palace behind him still standing, Asgard still standing, and felt the question settle into him differently than it ever had before, not as uncertainty, not as grief for a planet he never knew, as something that had finally found its ground. "I am the son of Jor-El," he said, "and I am the son of Odin." He let that be enough. Surtur retreated into fire and distance. The shadow constructs dissolved without their sustaining sorcery. The battle ended the way battles do, not with triumph, but with exhaustion and silence, and the slow inventory of what remained. Cal stood in the wreckage of Asgard's eastern courtyard and looked for Loki. Loki was gone. Had been gone, he suspected, since the first alarm. Not fled in cowardice, but vanished with the specific intentionality of someone who had planned an exit before planning an entrance. There would be a reckoning, not today, not in the hot hours after a battle, but eventually, when the grief of it had cooled enough to be examined. Thor found him there and stood beside him without speaking. Sif approached from the palace interior, blood on her armor and none of it hers. The warriors three emerged from the gate rebel with the particular energy of men who had survived something they would tell stories about forever. Odin came last, leaning on his staff, surveying the damage with one eye that had seen worse and knew it, looking at Cal with an expression that had no Asgardian word, but that every language that had ever existed had a word for. Pride, clean and complete, and without condition. Cal looked back at his father, and the question that had followed him since childhood, "What are you?" finally stopped feeling like an accusation and started feeling like an invitation.
Asgard rebuilt, as it always had, because that was the nature of eternal realms. Not that they avoided damage, but that they refused to be defined by it. In the weeks that followed Surtur's retreat, Cal worked alongside palace craftsmen and Asgardian engineers, lifting stone that would have taken teams of men and placing it with a precision that made the architects revise their timelines dramatically downward. It was deliberate, not a display, but a choice to use what he was in service of something concrete, something that left the world more whole than he'd found it. Frigga watched from the upper gallery one afternoon and said nothing, but she brought him tea that evening and held his face in her hands briefly, the way she had when he was a child, and no words were required. Thor declared loudly and to anyone within earshot that Cal had officially surpassed him in battle, and that this was entirely fine because it reflected well on Thor's early training influence. Sif said nothing about that and kept her expression carefully neutral. The political consequences spread outward like the battle's smoke, visible from realms away. Delegations arrived from 3 of the 9 realms, requesting audiences, some seeking alliance, some seeking reassurance, all of them recalibrating their understanding of what Asgard now contained. Odin received them with the patience of a man who had managed consequences before and found them manageable. But Loki was still gone, and somewhere beyond the 9 realms, in a fortress carved from a dead moon's bones, a being who had never once revised a plan without improving it was doing exactly that. Studying reports from the battle's aftermath, measuring the output data his agents had recorded, understanding for the first time that the variable he had dispatched an emissary to acquire was not, in fact, acquirable, which meant it would need to be addressed differently. Cal felt it sometimes in the quiet hours, not a premonition exactly, not the vulva's gift of foresight, but the specific awareness of someone who had learned to listen to the universe's frequencies. Something was coming, something that the defeat of Surtur had not prevented, but perhaps accelerated. He trained harder. He asked Odin questions he had never asked before about the cosmos beyond the 9 realms. He sat with the Kryptonian crystal on the nights when sleep didn't come, and let his father's, Jor-El's face remind him what it looked like to know the end was coming and choose love anyway. He was the son of a man who had saved one life when he couldn't save a world. He intended to do better. Above Asgard, the golden star burned on, and Kal-El, prince of the eternal realm, last son of Krypton, stood in its light and let it fill him, not with power, but with purpose. The galaxy had not finished with him yet. He was not finished with it either.